My legal name is James Michael Petrucelli. A little side note on Petrucelli, you know, the Italian people were so, and all of the ethnic groups that came to Fresno were so aware of their ethnicity, but wanted to be American. And, you know, I just thank God my grandfather didn't change the name to Peters or something, because so many of the people changed their names. Well, my grandfather, his way of making it more American was Petrucelli. It didn't sound as much. And when people mispronounce my name, I always tease them and say, you know, you don't play a cello, and you don't eat vermicelli. You eat vermicelli, and you play a cello. So it's Petrucelli. But everybody calls me Jim or Judge P. My nickname that's stuck with me my whole life is Petro. Both sides of the family, the Petrucelli side and the Frediani side, both came through Ellis Island. Their spouses, not at the time, were the Campapiano family and the D'Ambrosia family. So starting with my father's side, Dominic, or Domenico, more likely, that's what he came in as, but he changed it to Dominic, which again sounded a little more American. So Dominic came through Ellis Island. He was born in the late 1800s, 1893. And he came through in the early 1900s. He was 26, as I recall. And he and his brother migrated to Los Banos, California. And that's where they had a job waiting for them. In Los Banos, they drove 20 mule teams. I got a big kick out of that, and he would tell stories about how they would carry gypsum out to the fields, because he worked for a company called Miller and Lux, which anybody that knows the Valley history knows that they settled a large part of the west side of Fresno County and of all the counties, Merced County being up in Los Banos. But he was in Los Banos, and he was driving 20 mule teams with his brother, James. And about that time, A.P. Giannini had formed the Bank of Italy in San Francisco. And kind of a funny story that he always related to me, and I've related to so many people, with the fact that they were paid cash, and he would get money and he'd send it back to family, or he'd save it for his future, and he wanted to buy property and stuff like every immigrant did in America. So one day his brother James, who was older and smarter, came to him and said, you know, Dominic, he says, you keep your money in a coffee can under your mattress. He says, it's really not safe there. He says, somebody could take it. He says, oh, I don't worry about that. And of course, in broken English, he would tell me the story. He said, you know, Dominic, he says, there's a new bank in town. He said, what bank? He says, yeah, the Bank of Italy. And A.P. Giannini had started the Bank of Italy in San Francisco. And his first branch, the way I understand it, was in Los Banos. And it was still called the Bank of Italy. And he had Italian and Portuguese-speaking tellers that he hired in the area, because there was a lot of immigrants there with the dairies and with the workers and so on. So his brother proceeded to tell him, he says, you take it to the bank, and he says, they pay you money for having your money, and he says, it's safe, and you can get it anytime you want. He says, I don't know. He says, I'm a little worried. And so he finally convinced him to go to the bank. And the cute part of the story is my grandfather would tell the story. He says, I went to the bank, and he says, they had a nice Italian girl there that spoke Italian to me. But he says, I was worried. And so I asked her, I says, you know, how you not mix him up the money with my brother? We have the same name, Petrucelli. She says, oh, Dominic, don't worry about that. We use numbers. We don't even look at the names. We use numbers. Now, I need to stop and note that when my family came in on the Petrucelli side into America, it was Petrocelli, which is pretty common. It's not a super common name like Smith in America, but it's pretty common. I've seen it on the plumbing trucks back east and different things, construction companies. But Petra, or Petro, is rock, and Celli is small. So it's Little Rock, but it was with an O. And so I need to preface the rest of the story with that. And that's how he came into America, on his immigration papers and everything. So he said to the girl, he says, I don't know. He says, I'm worried you mix them up with the money. And she said to him, no, we use the account numbers. He says, I tell you what. He says, you make a mine with a U, and then you don't mix them up with the money. Now, subsequently, he married with a U, he bought property with a U, and hence my name is spelled with a U, but it's kind of uncommon. The other side of the family is still with an O. Now, the other side of the family, the D'Ambrosia side of the family, my grandmother, Emanuela, or Emma as she was known. She came in as Emanuela. She was at Ambrosia, and they settled in the Los Banos area. Now, there's not much history that I could find on them, and the family didn't talk about it as much. You know, oddly enough, the families were different, the Frediani side of my family and the Petrucelli side of the family. The pictures that I have here are really of the Campapiano maiden name of my grandmother on the Frediani side, and then the actual Americo Frediani family picture. They took formal pictures for some reason, and the Petrucelli side just didn't. I only have one recollection, and one of my cousins has the picture, I believe. It was a formal picture of my grandmother and grandfather married, and that was actually a studio photograph, but it was a large one too, as I recall, as a little boy, but I don't know where that ended up, frankly. So anyway, somehow, and I don't know the story because they never related it to me, Emanuela and Dominic were married, and they moved to the Kerman area. And they started farming in the Kerman area. And the census, all the way back to the 20s and 30s, showed that they were living in Kerman. He had bought a piece of property. He was a raisin farmer. And many of the Italian immigrants in particular were in the raisin industry, the grape industry, because of their background in Italy. And they were familiar with that. And the climate here is very similar to a lot of the areas they came from. So they started farming there. They had actually 6 children. One, Johnny, died in infancy, but he had an older brother, Nick Petrucelli. He had 2 older sisters, Marie, or Maria, and Louise, or Louisa, and then Jean. My dad's name was Jean Petrucelli. He also had a younger sister who I was very, very close to. She was not only my godmother, but she was kind of like my patron saint. At a young age, she was single, she never married, and at a young age, she moved to the convent in Monterey and became a nun. She ended up in the Franciscan order, and so not only am I very proud of that, but she was just very close to me. And my mom and her worked together at the bank until she left for the convent. So the families were very close. She used to babysit me a lot, and she was just very close to my mother. So as a young boy growing up, oddly enough, I spent every weekend practically in Monterey. When I first met my wife, we laughed about the fact that I knew Monterey as well as I did Fresno, because I just kind of grew up in that town. In fact, my father would, he would hit up all of the fruit growers and all of the grape growers and whatever vegetables were in season here in the Fresno area. He'd load them up into his pickup, and he even built a trailer to haul more fruit and some vegetables, and he would take them to the convent, and they would can things for the convalescent hospital, which they had on the grounds. In those days, there was a lot of nuns, and they were very frugal, and so they would can the fruit and the vegetables and different things, and they would actually serve it to the convalescent hospital. I doubt that they would let them do that nowadays, but this was back in the 50s and 60s. I spent a lot of time there, and my father even, interesting story, my father not only made friends with every Italian and Portuguese farmer on the way to Monterey so he could get more fruit. But then he decided, well, this is a good idea. I'll go down on the wharf and I'll make friends, because he was quite this, he had a gift of gab. He would make friends with all the Sicilian fishermen on the wharf. In those days, as a little boy, I recall there was nothing but fish markets on the wharf. There was a couple of curio shops and a couple of restaurants, but certainly not like today. As a little boy, my recollection of Monterey was, especially during the week, when we were there during the week, it was a sleepy Italian fishing village, inhabited mostly by Sicilians, and oddly enough, I would get a kick out of it as a little boy because I understood a lot more Italian than I do now. I would see a couple of young women, very hip for the 60s, pushing their baby carriages, speaking hard Sicilian. And it was just comical to me as a little boy, because I thought, wow, you know. But they really, of course, they had Italian festivals, and they had operas, and they had all kinds of things. And on that note, there was a legend in Monterey, if you will. His name was Frank Lucido. And Frank Lucido was a composer and a conductor. And they actually still to this day, I think, have a Frank Lucido Day, the Italian community, because he was so well known in the Italian community. He was just loved and revered, actually. Well, he and his wife didn't have any children. And they had a really beautiful house up on top of a hill in old Monterey, above the fire department and the police department and everything, up on a hill that actually from the old house had a view of the bay. It was beautiful. Anyway, when he passed away, he left it to the convent. Of course, the nuns had no use for it, but of course, my dad being their patron saint, and he was a farmer. He farmed raisins in Fresno like his father did, in Kerman actually, like his father did, and we'll talk more about him later. But it was interesting because the nuns came to my parents and said, look, you're over here all the time and you're staying in cheap hotels, because they weren't making any money at the time. In Seaside, we'd stay in cheap hotels over there, motels over there. They said, we'll sell you this house for market value cheap, you know, and it was cheap in those days. And of course, my dad was very nervous, and my mother even worse. She was a banker. But they said, well, don't worry about it. If you have a crop failure, we'll just waive the interest that year, and you don't have to make a payment, and you can go to the next year. So they bought the house from the convent, and they actually had the house in Monterey for many, many years. And of course, my mom and dad were all about trying to get ahead, just like their parents were. That was what they taught. They were children of the Depression, you know. And so they, my dad, with his own hands, built a house on the property. There was actually 3 substandard lots, so he could build a little 2-bedroom, 1-bath house. And that's where we stayed, and that way he could rent out the big house and had some income to help make the payment on the place. But so yeah, I spent a lot of time in Monterey. My aunt, sadly, you know, I think the Catholic Church has suffered over the generations, and my aunt was one of the youngest in the convent at the time, and she was in her late 20s. And so little by little, over the years, as I became an adult, the nuns kind of died off. They had a big convent actually in downtown Monterey, the Franciscan order. They sold that back to the diocese. They moved in the remaining nuns into the convent up in Jocelyn Canyon above Highway 1. And little by little they died off. My aunt became, she had a business background because she was a banker with my mom. So she became the manager of the convalescent hospital, and at some point in time after the Mother Superior of the convent passed away, she became the Mother Superior of the convent, which is the head of the convent, if you will. And sadly, she ended up burying almost all of them. I think she was the last surviving one when she died. So that was kind of the end of that Franciscan order in Monterey. But they really had an impact on that community, because when I was a young boy, as I say, the town was still fairly small. The Catholic Church had a big impact because of the Italian immigrants. But back to my grandfather's side of the family. They farmed in Fresno, and of course, in Kerman, excuse me. And like everybody in those days, the family helped the people get ahead. You know, they loaned them money, they helped them. And I don't know if it was a distrust of bank, or maybe their credit wasn't what it needed to be. I just don't know, but it seemed like every family that I ever knew, including my mom's side, the parents tried to do the very best they can. They bought property, then they helped the other person buy property. So my grandfather and grandmother lived in the Kerman area. Actually, as it ended up, as a little boy, I spent an awful lot of time with my great-grandmother, D'Ambrosia. She survived her husband and many of her children, actually. My grandfather really never talked about his family too much other than his brother. And I don't know if there was any other siblings that may have passed away before they came to America or what. But my grandmother had 2 brothers, Ben and Frank, and they were still in Los Banos, and we visited with them a lot, and they came down to Kerman a lot and stuff. But Mama Don, as we used to call her, you know, 100-year-old grandma, Mama Don would stay with Emanuela and Dominic. And so I had a lot of fond memories of trying to speak Italian with her. And I got a big kick out of her because she wasn't, you know, her sight wasn't very good, her hearing wasn't very good, and television was a big deal to someone born in the early 1800s. So she would sit on a little stool a little child stool, right by the edge of the TV and kind of look at the screen so she could see it closer and listen real close. She was cute, but she lived to over 100. She died at 101. A little funny thing in those days, and I don't recall as a little boy if J.C. Penney was still alive or not, but J.C. Penney or his company would send a birthday cake to every American that turned 100. Every American got a birthday cake on their 100th birthday. I have no idea how they kept track of that through census or whatever, but I thought it was a big deal to the family, you know, because JCPenney in those days was the Amazon of America, you know, with their giant catalogs and stuff. So that's kind of the Petrucelli side. My dad farmed in Kerman all of his life, the Kerman-Biola area. I took over the farms in the late 70s. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get on my story. But on my mom's side, Americo Frediani came over as a young boy from Naples, landed in Ellis Island. And the very touching story that he told me, that it didn't have as much an impact when I was young, of course, many things don't. But he told me at 16 years old, and I wonder about the courage that those people had. I just can't imagine. You know, and we all know that they were a little more mature in those days than our 16-year-olds, but still. And more importantly, things were bad in Europe, and they wanted a better life. So his mother and his father put him on a ship in Naples. And he said, they gave me a couple of sticks of salami and a couple of loaves of bread and a big jug of wine, and said, God bless you. We hope we see you again. They never did. And I mean, the courage that it takes for a family to do that because you want your child to have a better life. So Americo would tell the story about steerage, and I had no concept of what steerage was. I'd never even seen a big ship, much less knew what steerage was. And he would tell stories about how it was dark because there was no windows, and they had lights, but you know, no windows, so you couldn't see where you were when the seas got rough or anything else. But he also told stories about how, you know, we were all a bunch of immigrants coming from all over the world. And he said the Germans would be in one corner, and the Hungarians would be in another corner, the Armenians would be in another corner, and the Italians would be in another corner. And we couldn't understand each other, and we didn't eat the same foods, and so then play the same music, but we did okay. We did okay. And he said, so, you know, I didn't have any concept of that until the movie Titanic came out as an adult. And you know, that movie talked so much about steerage and showed how they were down in the bottom of the ship and the guards wouldn't let them go up and be with the rich people and so on. And so it had so much more of an impact as an adult than it did as a child. But the story that he told that to this day is, when I tell people, they can understand my emotion. He said, we'd been on the ship for a long time. It takes usually about 14 days to get over here in those days. And he said, we'd been on the ship for a long time. Didn't know where we were because there was no windows. But he says, all of a sudden the sea was calm, but he says the ship started listing very badly, and it kept listing more and more and more. And he says people were scared. They were terrified that something was going wrong. And he said, finally, he says, the men just got together and pushed the guards out of the way and said, come on. And they all ran up on the decks. They were, I mean, honestly, I think they believed they were going to bail out over the ship. And he says, there was nobody on his side of the ship. And he says, as they ran around the ship looking for people, he says, it seemed like the entire ship was on deck on one side of the ship because the Statue of Liberty had come into view. And everybody was excited, even the rich people, about getting to America. And I thought, wow, I can only imagine the emotions that he felt as he saw America in the distance. So he landed in Ellis Island. Again, talk about courage. When they put him on the boat, they gave him the name and the address of one cousin that they had been in communication with. He had never met this cousin. I'm not sure if he was born in America or not, but he had never met the cousin. And he promised them that he could get him a job digging in the subways in New York City. And so that was his key to America, that he had to have, you know, in those days you had to have a job, you had to have somebody sponsoring you. And so that was his key to America. And so he dug subways in New York, and he dug subways for many years until he got enough money to immigrate to Fresno. and he immigrated to the Fresno area. Now, a little side note on that story that I have to tell you, and this is when he was an adult and he had children. But my grandfather, Americo, dug subways in Boston. And many of you that'll be watching this are familiar with another Italian family here in town, Baldassare Forestier, the famous Fresno Underground Gardens. And I remember telling my grandson the story when I took him there, but my mother used to tell the cutest story about Baldassare Forestier and my grandfather. They were from the same area in Italy, but more importantly, they bonded over this friendship of farming because as most people who know the story of Baldassare know, that he actually came to farm in the Fresno area. My grandfather bought land near Easton, which was very good and very fertile. He bought land where we know Highway City is now, and the hard pan is very, very shallow. So he was having a hard time and decided to actually build a resort underground, which is another story in itself. So he'd been digging, and my grandfather and he developed a friendship, and I don't know how that happened because my mother had no recollection. But the funny part of the story is, she says, many, many Sundays we would go over there and bring food and wine, and we'd talk and visit with Baldassare. And he didn't have a wife at the time, and I think he tried to have a wife for a short period of time. But anyway, they would go over there and visit. And she says it was really the first time she took me to the underground garden. She told me the story. She said, honestly, anything you read about him, he was a little crazy to us kids. He said he was just a crazy man about his caves. He didn't want the kids running down the caves. And of course, little children, they were bored. They weren't drinking wine and stuff. And so they wanted to run down all the little caves and the alleyways and stuff. He said he would come yelling at us, don't run, don't touch the shovels, don't touch the wheelbarrows and stuff. She thought he was a little bit off, and of course from a child's perspective, that's probably the case. But it's a tie-in that my family has to that family that just kind of makes me smile when I think about it. My mother's a little girl running through those caves. Anyway, so Americo ended up in Fresno, and he hadn't quite got everything together to where he could buy property yet. So, and I don't know how the story, they're all gone. I don't know how he got connected to the Campopiano family. But an early, I want to say 20s or 30s, probably 30s, census that I found actually has him living with the Campopiano family. And boy, I can tell you, they had a tiny little house. They were not farmers, and I don't know what my great-grandfather died because what he did because he died before I was born. But they lived in a little house in West Fresno where all the immigrants settled. And there was, in the Campopiano family, there was the father, the mother, and their names have slipped me right now, but they had Angelina, the daughter, Catherine, or Conchetta, and I'll explain that story in a minute. And then they had 6 sons. They had 6 sons. And of course, one of the pictures is of that Campopiano family with the Mustache Pete brothers and the father and the mother sitting there, the 2 daughters on either side, and then the 6 brothers in the back. And they all had varying different levels of success. One of my Uncle Joe actually was a carny. He traveled with the carnivals, and as a little boy we would go and run into him at a carnival when we knew he was someplace. I don't know what all he did at the carnival, but he loved that vagabond life, never married or anything, but most of them were very successful. That generation, college wasn't pushed, so they were all in business and different things, but they were all fairly successful. Angelina stayed in Fresno. She married an Italian man here, and we would visit with them as a young man. But Catherine Campopiano was there. My grandfather, as I recall, was 26, and she was 10 or 11. There was 11 years difference between them, or maybe he was a little bit older. I don't recall now, but he lived there, and the Campopiano family, I think the intention is that he was going to marry Catherine, and there was 11 years difference between them, which was very common in those days. I think my grandparents, especially the Frediani side, they loved each other dearly, and I knew it. But I think a lot of the marriages were kind of like, good family, hardworking, healthy woman, can bear children, and I'm gonna marry her. And I think that they were always younger. It seemed like they were always 10 to 12, 15 years younger. And that, of course, was also because the men many times came over here first. He was 16 when he came. My grandmother came with her family, and she was only 9. And that's an interesting story. So the Campapiano family came in from Naples also. They were not from the same area my grandfather, a little bit farther south, but they actually came in through Ellis Island also. And of course, from a 9-year-old girl's perspective, and I hope I can relate that part of the story without being too emotional, but my grandmother would tell stories about entering the great hall of Ellis Island. And of course, I had never been there when she's telling me these stories. She said it was so big. She said it was so massive. And of course, if anybody's ever been to Ellis Island, as an adult, I went there, and it's a big room, but it's not all that massive. But from a 9-year-old girl's perspective, it must have been huge, because she had never seen a building that big, coming from the stone buildings of Italy and stuff. But she was 9 years old, and she tells the story about how, in those days, a lot of the, if not all of the immigration officers were Irish. And she said, he asked her name and such, and her papers, and she said her name was Concetta, and which was not an uncommon Italian name. He says, Concetta. What, Concetta? He says, you're Catherine. And so he wrote Catherine down, and she lived most of her life as Catherine. We buried her as Concetta, but she lived most of her life as Catherine. But you know, when I went to the, and the rest of that story is that they checked her and she had fever, and they actually, and anybody that's ever been to Ellis Island knows that they've restored the main building, but they've never gotten around to restoring the hospital, which is right across the harbor where the boats would pull in, or the dock, I guess you'd call it. And so when I was there, not only did the Great Hall surprise me, but I looked at this dreary building, which probably looked a lot better when it was operational. My grandmother was forced to stay there for 11 days. She was 9 years old. And the threat was that, you know, if she tests positive or if she doesn't recover, they thought she had whatever this disease of the time was, some kind of rubellic fever or yellow fever or whatever it was, then you're gonna have to send her back. We're just gonna send her back. And if you can go, if you want, you and your boys, but if not, we're gonna send her back anyway. And she said, I was so terrified as she was locked up, if you will, in the hospital at 9 years old. And when I stood in that great hall, I wondered how scared they both were, especially a 9-year-old, at the threat of going back, because this was America. This was where we were going to find our fortune. This is where we were going to be free from all the hardships of Italy. And I really broke down, and I thought, you know, they had dreams that were fulfilled, but I wonder what their dreams for their offspring were. I wondered as I sat there, I was a Superior Court judge in one of the largest states in the Union, and I wondered if they could have even imagined. I'm only second generation born here. My parents were the first generation born here. And I wondered if they could have even dreamt what was possible for their children in this great land that we have. And so it was a very emotional experience for me. I loved it. It was great. And I bought, they have a wall there that you can donate money to the foundation. And I have the couple of plates there that are posted on the wall that says the Dominic Petrucelli family and the Americo Frediani family. So they'll be there forever. My grandfather bought, on the Frediani side, he bought land in the eastern area, Fig and Central. He bought land, and he had a little dairy, he had a little cotton, he had a little this and a lot of that. And my grandmother worked in the packing house like so many of the women did in those days. They just manual labor, but they had to help support the farm and everything else. And a little side note, my grandfather didn't share, my mother shared, because she remembers as a little girl. She said that, I think the only reason we saved the farm was that my grandfather's house had a cellar. And of course, those days, everybody had to have a cellar because they canned their sauce, they canned their peppers, they canned everything. So you had to have a cellar. The wine had to be in the cellar. But she said, there's a truck that would come once or twice a week and unload barrels into the cellar and unload and take out barrels out of the cellar. And then another man would come around in a big fancy car and he'd give my grandfather money. And this was during Prohibition. And she surmised, and I certainly have surmised, that the only reason my grandfather was able to keep the farm is because he was way out in the country in those days. Fig and Central was way outside of Fresno. That somebody saw that was a good place to store some of their hooch that they were selling in the speakeasies in Fresno at the time. And so it probably saved my family's farm. So he lived and died in that area, and all of his children. And he had, on my mother's side, he had, his oldest daughter was Mary. His next oldest daughter was Bernice. And his third was my mother, Josephine Frediani. And then there was Palmyra. They also had a girl, and I don't recall where the order was, but they had a girl that died in infancy also, which wasn't that uncommon in those days. But my grandfather wasn't about to give up, so he kept trying. And they finally had Junior, Americo Frediani Jr. And of course, the family always called him Junior. He was my Uncle Junior. And his wife, who was a Lombardo, his wife called him Freddie, and all of his friends called him Freddie because he didn't like Junior that much, but the family all called him Junior. So anyway, they, little interesting part of that time period with families, and both sides this happened to. You know, their social circle was really the church and the Italian Federation and the Sons of Italy and those groups that they belonged to. And so they really, first of all, it was a big deal to marry Italian. It just was. A little side note on that I have to share. All of my aunts and uncles on both sides married Italians. They just had to marry Italians. I think we, the second generation, kind of broke that mold, but that first generation, they had to marry Italians. And of course, in those days, it was also good because the Italians were Catholics, and that was important. But I remember as a young man, a little boy more likely, my Aunt Palmyra, when she brought home the whitest, red-haired, nice man from Arkansas who wasn't Catholic, and you would have thought there was an earthquake in Fresno. I remember my grandmother cried, my grandfather yelled, all the sisters were crying. It was just like it was the end of the world. And oddly enough, you know, I think probably every ethnic group has gone through this, where they have to break the mold. We see it with the Indian societies now. We see it with all the ethnic groups, the Armenian groups, and it was just the way they knew. It's what they knew. But this man was so kind to her, and he loved her so much, and he married her in the Catholic Church and everything, and it was wonderful. And they just were, you know, everybody was happy. That was my Uncle Donnie, and he was a great, laughing, fun American. And so it was really kind of neat. It really was kind of neat. But the point I'm making, that I was getting to the story is that it seemed like in those days, there was a lot of inter-family marriages. For instance, my Aunt Mary married into the Sinopoli family. George Sinopoli was a World War II veteran, a pilot, and she married into the Sinopoli family. On my father's side, my Aunt Louise, his sister, his older sister, his brother Nick married George Sinopoli's sister. And so my Petrucelli uncle was married to one of the Sinopolis. My Frediani aunt was married to one of the Sinopolis. So there was all this intermarriage like that. And a couple of my dad's sisters actually married a couple of brothers, the Delash brothers from Patterson area, Modesto area. So it was real common in those days. And of course it made for wonderful family events. I mean, you know, my recollection of growing up in the Italian household in those days is that every holiday, every birthday, any reason was a celebration. My God, the women just cooked like they'd cook all day, the day before and so on. And I just loved to go and spend time with my grandparents because it was different. My parents were hardworking, younger, trying to get ahead, and by that time, my grandparents had slowed down a little bit, and my grandmother wasn't working in the packing house, and my grandfather was still farming a little bit, but his son was taking over and so on. But it was just a joy to sit there with him. I remember as a little boy, a little funny story about my grandfather. Every morning, without missing a morning, he'd get me in his old Chevy and he'd drive me to West Fresno. Because in West Fresno was the Naples Bakery. And he had to buy a fresh loaf of French bread every day. Every day he had to buy a French loaf of bread. And I remember it was right off of Kearney Boulevard there in the west side of Fresno. And it was the Naples Bakery, small. The building was there into my adulthood, but it's gone now. But it was a little tiny place, and we'd go in and buy one loaf of French bread and putt-putt back to Easton. And he had to have his fresh French bread. And of course, if he didn't finish the loaf of bread, it went in the bread drawer, because my grandmother had to have a bread drawer where the French bread got stale for French toast and for stuffing and for whatever she used it for, you know. So the ends of the French bread would stay in that drawer until they got hard enough for her to cook with. But that's a beautiful recollection. So I enjoyed staying with them. But the family gatherings in those days, and I know all of the Italian families and all of the ethnic groups, they spent more time together. You know, part of it was they didn't have television, they didn't have radio as much, and music wasn't as important coming from somebody else. If we had a musician in the family or somebody played an instrument, then we did that. But most of it was just socializing. You know, one of the things that I miss as an adult today, and we try and do it, but it's hard, nobody goes visiting anymore. Visiting was a big deal. And if you ask I think the new generation, if you ask them, do you know what visiting is? Well, I assume you're going somewhere, or you're going to do something. Yeah, but you know, in those days, unannounced, and you had to be careful. You know, I remember my parents and my grandparents, well, you don't want to go at dinner time because that's not nice, you know. You got to go after dinner time, or you got to go in the early afternoon and leave before dinner time unless they ask you to stay and so on. But we would go visiting, and that just meant going to see somebody. Unannounced, didn't bother telling anybody because everybody welcomed everybody into their home. You just knocked on the door and you visited, and the men would maybe have some wine or a cold beer if it was hot. The women would throw together some fruit or whatever, and they'd just talk, you know. And visiting was a big part of growing up. And of course the kids got close, and because they played. They didn't have video games, they didn't watch videos and stuff. They just played. And it made the families close. It made more for community. And I miss that. I miss that as an adult now. We don't do enough of that. And you know, my wife and I try and make sure that we ask friends to go out to dinner or ask friends to come over for dinner and stuff. But we tend to revolve around an event now. We have to do something, as opposed to just come on over and visit. And oddly enough, I'm a member of the Dante Club, and so some of my brothers still just drop by and we visit a little bit and have a glass of wine. So that's fun. But again, they're kind of old school too, you know. So my grandparents in Easton raised their children. They all went to Fort Washington High School. On the Kerman side, interesting side note about the Kerman side, I went to the same high school that all of my father and his siblings went to. Kerman Union High School was an old high school right on Madera Avenue. And it was a beautiful old building. And they all graduated from Kerman High School. And I was actually the last class to graduate from Kerman High School before they tore it down, or it turned into a couple of other things before they tore it down. I think it burned down and they tore it down. But kind of an interesting story sometimes when families stay in the same area. My father, on the Petrucelli side, bought property with the help of his father and the Freddie Annie side. They helped him buy land in the Kerman area. And so my father farmed raisins in the Kerman area too. Funny story about the grandparents helping my father. And my mother liked to laugh at this story. Her father was one of the more educated in our family. you know, most of the immigrants, they were lucky if they finished a grammar school or whatever, and they came over young. But my grandfather on the Frediani side was very well read, and he kept up with current events and everything, and he was much more of a visionary. And not to denigrate my Petrucelli side, but they were just hard workers. My grandfather thought a lot more about things. So my grandfather did his very best after my father got out of the Navy, after World War II. He did his very best to talk him into buying a piece of property at the corner of Blackstone and Shields. Now this was in the late 40s. And my father, you know, Americo, he says, I don't know anything about orchards. It was an orchard. I want vineyards. He says, well, you don't buy the orchard. He says, look at where Fresno's going. At the time, Olive Avenue was probably about far north as the Borellis, the pasta people, they lived on Olive, a big house on Olive. And the city was going north for sure, but Olive was probably the farthest it had gone at that point. But my grandfather was convinced that that property wasn't going to be for farming, that it was going to be for business someday. Well, of course, my mother loved to give him heck about that because it ended up being Manchester Center, and he probably could have sold it and retired instead of farmed his whole life. But, you know, hindsight's always 20/20, and she just liked to jab at him a little bit. But so my mom and dad bought their first ranch was a little ranch in the Kerman-Biola area. And of course, in those days, one of the things that was important to the ethnic groups was to try and not only help your children get ahead and your in-laws get ahead, you know, if you, even like my Frediani side helped my dad, but it was also to try and expand a little bit. They just, you know, they lived through the Depression and they just didn't spend much. I mean, my wife still gives me a hard time about saving things, you know. And I remember, and I'll go into that in more detail, but when I left the ranch, I filled up truckloads to donate because I was of the school of thought, like my parents had taught me, if you took out something that still worked because you wanted something different or because it wasn't working as well as it once did, you saved it because it was still working. And you never know when you might need that. So, you know, that generation taught us to just, you never know, so you should save. And so it was interesting because that first generation was taught that you need to expand and you need to save. So even when they started making money, and every ethnic group was like this, I think, it wasn't just, well, we're going to pay off our land. It's like, well, we're going to pay down our land so that we can buy more land. And so my dad was continuing to buy land up until I was an adult. And we farmed vineyard in the Kerman-Biola area. And of course, it was, in those days, it was a real struggle to get ahead. This was in the 50s. And so my dad, you know, always had a job. And my mom always had a job, which was very modern for those days. But she worked at the bank. She was a banker. And she went to the Bank of America, the former Bank of Italy. And even the reason I know so much about the Bank of Italy and the Bank of America is because she even tried to get me to become a banker when I was younger because she thought that was such a great profession. And one of the requirements of Bank of America, and boy, this was in the probably 60s or 70s, she had to read Biography of a Bank, written by A.P. Giannini. And so you knew everything there was about the Bank of America and about his life and his goals and so on. But anyway, she was a banker and worked there, you know, had children. I have one sibling. My sister Melissa is 8.5 years younger than I am. So I'm 72 and she's 60, whatever. Lawyers don't do math, so anyway. My sister was growing up and I left the home very young. I'll go into that a little bit more. But so my mom always worked and at the bank. My dad had different jobs. He worked for Ralston Purina had a plant here in town, and he drove truck for them for many, many years. And then as the farm got a little bit more successful, he tried to farm full time. But he also needed to make a little extra money. So, and this is how my dad got into law enforcement. He was actually in law enforcement. which I was in law enforcement, and I'll tell that in a moment. But so my dad, they had in Fresno County, and I think even in some parts of America, there still are what's called the constable system. In Fresno County, we had the constable system. In other words, you had the police department in the city of Fresno. You had the county sheriff in the county areas of the metropolitan area, and you had surrounding county areas that were under the jurisdiction of the sheriff. But each judicial district actually had a judge and a constable. Now, they were what we refer to as misdemeanor courts, or what we used to refer to as misdemeanor courts. They couldn't do felony trials, they couldn't do divorces, they couldn't do probate, but they did all of the misdemeanor low-level crimes. They did the small claims actions, they did the unlawful detain or eviction issues, and so on. And those judges were actually elected by the people in that judicial district. There was the Kerman Judicial District, there was the Shaver Judicial District, there was the Carruthers Judicial District, there was the Kingsburg Judicial District, the Selma Judicial District, the Coalinga Judicial District, and so on. So those judicial districts were made up of a geographical area with an elected judge who was a justice court judge. They had justice courts in those areas. Kind of an interesting concept because they were non-lawyers. They were just a well-respected person in the community. And if somebody passed away in office or quit or whatever, then the Board of Supervisors would actually appoint that person. But generally, they were elected by the community. And of course, the Board of Supervisors, the supervisor for that judicial district, had the most say in the matter. And he usually knew who the people wanted and would communicate with those people. So it was usually a well-respected man in the community. So the elected constable, some of them had deputies because the areas were getting more populated. Some of them did not. It was just the constable. But even the ones that had deputies, like in the Kerman Judicial District, the constable at the time was Henry Wolf. They needed help sometimes. And so what they would do is they would deputize as deputy constables members in the community that were willing to do this, and they would have them work events, if you will. And many times they were like the football games at the high school, where you knew you were going to have a lot of people there, you needed an officer on site. I honestly don't even know if there was these security firms in those days, you know? I mean, they would just pay an hourly wage to have a deputy constable be there on the grounds. And so my dad would make extra money on a Friday night, and he'd walk around the grounds and make sure that everything was okay. Now, interestingly enough, in those days, and we're talking in the 50s and 60s, there was no police training. There was just no police training. And you bought a .38 revolver, a wheel gun we called them when I was young, and you put a holster on your belt, and they gave you a badge, and usually it was on a leather slip in your pocket kind of thing where the badge hung over your shirt pocket, and you had a pair of handcuffs in case you needed to handcuff somebody. But it was interesting, and oddly enough, not only did it help my parents get ahead, but I think it kind of got in my dad's blood. It really did. So while I was still a young man, I think maybe even in grammar school, he ran for constable. And he became the constable in the Kerman Judicial District. Now, I have fond memories of that because as the constable, he was also responsible for transporting prisoners. Even though they were misdemeanors, they still had to appear in court. And many times they were released, they bailed out, whatever. But every morning, he would bring a load of prisoners, however many there was, and believe me, if there was one or two, that was a lot, out to the justice court. So as a young man, anytime I wasn't working, and again, there was so different than it is today. Not only did they not have police training, but more importantly, they used their own car. They used their own car. Well, my dad was a farmer. He had a pickup. That's what he had. And so if he had room for me, I could ride in the pickup with him and the prisoner, but that was the only way I could go. And I mean, it sounds funny today, but they actually had a red screen with a spring that they would fit over the spotlight, because he was a farmer, to check the ditches and to check his fields. He had a spotlight, and if you didn't, you had to have one put into your car. But they actually had a red lens they would put on that. The county, as I recalled, I think it was the county, would actually put a radio in. So they had a radio in the car, and they put a siren in under the hood somewhere. So they had a siren, they had this red light, and they had a radio. But that was it. And the only thing that was given to them, really, was the radio and the siren, I think. My dad may have had to buy the siren, I don't recall. But it was really a different time because, you know, it was law enforcement as it used to be. And it was fascinating to me growing up because I ended up going into law enforcement and watching the changes in law enforcement. In those days, it wasn't a bad thing to know everybody in your area. You knew who the good people were and you knew who the bad people were. And frankly, today it's looked upon as an evil thing because you know people and you're not supposed to know people. But it made for a different type of law enforcement. It really made for a very efficient law enforcement. You know, questioning the people that you knew had stolen a certain item before out of a farm kind of shortcut things a little bit. You know, where were you the other night, and so on and so forth. But so I had a real interesting period growing up with my dad being in law enforcement, being in grammar school and then high school. You can imagine the cop's son. And in those days, he was the cop. He was the constable. He had a deputy, and if you know the Valley area a little bit, he was headquartered in Kermit. He had when he was a deputy constable, I didn't mention, he did, when the bug bit him, he did go on full-time as a deputy constable. He was a deputy constable for some period of time before he became a constable, ran for constable. But I used to go with him to the court, and that's where I really fell in love with the law. And I'd be mesmerized sitting there hour after hour. He had this little oak desk, and it was in the courtroom, and it was an old oak desk, small, one drawer, and I would sit there and I'd watch the judge. Now, in those days, keep in mind, this judge, he wasn't a lawyer. He did wear a suit, never a robe. He wore a Stetson on the bench. True story, his name was Harley Roberts, and I have a picture, I didn't bring it, but I have a picture of Harley and my dad and his deputies and the court staff out in front of the Justice Court. But Harley Roberts, and he smoked a cigar on the bench. Smoked a cigar on the bench. Now, you know, I can't imagine all the rules that were being broken as I look back at it, but the point is he dealt out justice, and he really did. And I was fascinated by the lawyers. I was fascinated by the law. And I just sat at that desk and watched him, and I said, you know, I would really like to be a lawyer. And probably at that point, too, it bit me that, you know, maybe someday even a judge. And I didn't understand how you became a judge or a lawyer or anything. I was a young man or a young boy. But I really was fascinated by the law and how it worked and the lawyers. And of course, you know, I kind of got my dad's gift of gab, so everybody in the family, oh, you should be a lawyer. You're always arguing about something. But so I used to sit there day after day after day and watch his court proceedings. So my dad was a constable for many years. And a little side note, one of his deputies, he hired deputies. There was a deputy in the Biola area. There was a deputy in the Tranquility area. There was a deputy in the San Joaquin area. Well, one of his deputies, who became one of his very, very best friends, was a man by the name of Adrian White. And Adrian White was the deputy in San Joaquin. And during that period of time, you know, because we would socialize and stuff, my dad and he were very close, I got to meet his children. And one of his daughters was Margaret Mims. And so Margie and I go back a long, long ways, and I'm very proud of that. And of course, I have a little story about that I'll tell in a moment too. But yeah, Margie and I go back a long ways. And there's another part of Adrian White that is one of those, you know, stories you only read about, but I'll share with you. My father was, in those days they had their own cars, as I said. There weren't police cars. They They bought their own cars. And this was the days before collapsible steering columns. And my father was out on James Road going to Tranquility, and Adrian was in San Joaquin, which is very close to Tranquility. And he went to pass a lady, and this lady ran him off the road. And the only reason we know that is because she went to a bar and was bragging about how she had ran this cop off the road and she had killed another cop, apparently she was bragging about. And, but what happened is just bad luck. My father ran off the road at a point where the edge of the road came down but ended on a canal bank. And again, before collapsible steering columns, thank God he had a seatbelt, but my father broke off the steering wheel. The car turned end over end, and actually the left front wheel pushed the steering column up into my father's head and caught his head between the top of the car and the steering column. Adrian was heading over to meet my dad, didn't see him because he figured he'd be in Tranquility by this time. Of course, took James Road, which is the main road that my dad would have taken, found the accident, and in those adrenaline stories that you hear about, now this is Margie Mims, our current sheriff, soon to retire, her father. On those days when they had the hard tops, I think they called them, where the window actually had a metal frame around it. That man, and he was a large man, but you know, you hear these stories and you don't believe them, but I saw the car. That man actually grabbed the top of that door and bent that door frame down and popped the top hinge of that door. Herculean strength. And pulled my dad out, threw him in his patrol car, and took him to Fresno. Because there was no ambulances in the rural areas in those days. They were rolling an ambulance when he called for it from Fresno. And they told him, it'll be 20 minutes before we get there. And of course, fast forward, the doctors told him, he said he never would have made it. He never would have made it if he waited for the ambulance. So Adrian took him as fast as he could into Fresno, saved his life. My dad was in a coma for many months, had terrible brain injuries, was never the same. But they saved his life. And I was 16 years old at the time. So there was always a relationship. And one of the things I'm really proud of with my dad was not only did he work hard and get ahead, and my mom was always, I mean, I remember as a kid boxing raisins. In those days, it was such an old procedure. The trailers would come in out of the fields and they'd rake the raisins out of the trailers onto a shaker. And my mother would work the shaker all day long, right along with her husband. She'd take vacation from work and she'd work out there all day long on the raisins. And they were really a team, and everything that they built was together. And in those days, the ethnic families were so hardworking because they had seen what their parents had gone through, and they wanted to get ahead and have a better life for their children. So one of the things I'm really proud about my father is that he saw that things were changing. And so he decided, oh, and I should note that at the time Adrian White decided he wanted to be a constable, so he left my dad and ran for election in the Carruthers area. So he was the constable in the Carruthers area. So Adrian, the constable in the Carruthers area, my dad, the constable in the Kerman area, decided, you know, we really need to professionalize law enforcement a little bit. And so what he did is he forced, in those days, you know, they could go and pay their own way, but it wasn't like it was part of the deal. He actually forced his deputies to go to the police academy, which was unheard of. The constables never went to the police academy. And then when they got out, he said, okay, now we're going to wear uniforms too. So he and a few of the other constables got together and actually developed a patch for their uniforms that said Fresno County Constable. That way there was one patch for everybody. And so here they were and he made them buy patrol cars. They would get together with the sheriff's department, and when they bought patrol cars, they would get a good deal, of course, because the sheriff was happy to help them. They would get a good deal on the patrol cars, so they would buy a real patrol car with real cages and with real red lights and siren and with uniforms and a police academy, post-certified police academy. And it was really pretty impressive, and that was really my dad and Adrian's doing. They really pushed for that, and I know Margie's very proud of that too. But anyway, and his reward, if you will, is that in the 70s, and I want to say 74, but I'm not 100% sure, in the 70s, there was a movement in Fresno County to consolidate the constables, to take the constables into the sheriff's department and have jurisdiction countywide. The way it worked originally is that, you know, it was kind of like the police department almost. You got to understand that while the police department and the city has city limits, and the chief of police is responsible for law enforcement in that area, if, for whatever reason, the sheriff said, you know what, sir, just step out of the way, we're going to take over this investigation. The county has jurisdiction over the city. Well, the way it worked in the justice court districts was that the constable had jurisdiction, but quite frankly, even after they were trained, they were uniformed police officers, if you will. They weren't detectives. So the sheriff's department would come in and do all the detective work. They would come in and do the identification bureau works, the casts for tires, the fingerprints, all of the stuff that you normally would think of gathering evidence. The sheriff's department would always do that. So there was a movement on, and quite frankly, my dad, Adrian's district, and I think one others were the only ones that were really going to the academy, getting uniforms, getting professional training. So the sheriff and the county felt like, you know, we need to really standardize this for the county. And it was a good thing in the 70s. But Adrian, my dad, and one other's constable, I don't recall which one, were promoted to sergeants, and all of their deputies became deputy sheriffs. But so that was kind of recognition by the sheriff that, you know, you guys really tried to make your area professional. And that was something my dad was always really proud of. And he retired from the sheriff's department as a sergeant. So that was neat. But, you know, it was something that really showed that his dedication to law enforcement. So I always had that in the back of my mind. Law enforcement, law, being a judge. So, you know, what am I going to do? Well, you know, life goes on. I fell in love with a high school sweetheart, got married way too young, and had a child in 1970, my only son, Vincent. And so, you know, and of course in those days with the immigrant families, it wasn't if you're going to college, it was where you're going to college. And so I was going to Fresno State and, you know, working hard, having a young child and a wife, and she was working, of course, too, and everything. But I was lucky to finish college, and so the thought of going to law school, and of course in those days there wasn't any law school in Fresno. The thought of going to law school was just a pipe dream for me, and I couldn't imagine doing that with my family. I had a young family. Well, I ended up finishing college, getting divorced, and so now I'm raising a young son. When he was, I think about 7 years old, I got custody of him and I raised him. And so I was really kind of deeply entrenched. But prior to that, after I got divorced, my son was here in Fresno, and the thought of leaving and going away to college just wasn't something I wanted to entertain. That coupled with the fact that I always admired my dad, and so I became a deputy sheriff. In 1974, I joined the Fresno County Sheriff's Department, first as a correctional officer, and then as a deputy sheriff. And I have a photograph, I think, somewhere of Mel Wilmerth, one of our prior sheriffs, swearing me in with my dad standing there very proudly, both of us in uniform, and I was the last deputy that Mel Wilmerth swore in. Kind of an interesting historical side note. I was the last one that Mel Wilmerth swore in as a deputy. In those days, they didn't hire very many people. The departments were small, and it took a long time to get hired. They hired one or two at a time over a period of a couple of years that the test lasted, you know. And Little side note on that, I had cooked and tended bar all through college. And I have to share this story because if perchance Jimmy Pardini ever hears it, he's heard the story, he'll laugh about it because he's heard it. I had cooked and tended bar through college, and one of my fraternity brothers, I was in Alpha Gamma Rho fraternity, and one of my fraternity brothers was dating Paul Fansler's daughter. Well, you know, I'm 72, and so her name slips my memory right now, and I'm sorry about that. Paula Fansler. And so I got to know Paul and actually started working for him to make extra money cleaning offices, some of his offices and stuff. So I had a lot of background in the restaurant business, working, tending bar, cooking at different restaurants during college. And so one thing led to another, and Paula let me know that Piccadilly Center had just been built. And of course, those old Fresno people that know the Pardini story, Al Pardini was an amazing man, just an amazing man. I can't say enough about him. And of course, Jimmy and his sons are doing a wonderful job in honoring Al Pardini's legacy. But Al Pardini came from Santa Cruz and actually had gosh, it was out on near Clinton, a Town and Country Lodge. I think it was Town and Country Lodge. That's where he first started. And he ended up working for, with the Wathen brothers, opened up Cedar Lanes, opened up Pardini's, opened up a number of different restaurants here in town. But in the early 70s, Paul had built Piccadilly Shopping Center. And believe me, Piccadilly Shopping Center was way out in the country. It was the last of the last out there. Development hadn't gotten that far out there on Shaw Avenue. But it was a beautiful, beautiful shopping center, and Al had decided to build a magnificent restaurant there, magnificent restaurant at the corner there of Van Ness Extension and Shaw. Well, Al had been running Pardini's out in Sunnyside. That was his flagship. And of course, Jimmy, his son, was basically running the show now, so Al could put his energy into opening this new restaurant, because Jimmy was running Sunnyside like a clock. He had a chef that had been there for many years, and you know, Jimmy's a great restaurateur also. But so Al had opened up the restaurant and had let it be known to Paul Fansler that, you know, he was kind of tired of working the room and shaking hands and watching things. Al really loved being in the kitchen, cutting meat. That's what he loved doing. He loved cutting meat. He loved cooking a little bit. He loved setting up a banquet. He just got tired. The public is hard, as we know. And so he kind of got tired of working the dining room. But he kind of let Paul know. He said, you know, he says, I'd really like to find a large Italian man that could help me out, that could, you know, take my place in the dining room, because Jimmy's busy, he's working all the time, and, you know, and maybe if he got good, he could help Jimmy take some time off and stuff. Well, not very many people know, but, you know, the restaurant business is just 24/7. So much so, in fact, that at the top of, and I don't know what it is today, but at the top of Piccadilly Pardini's, there's actually an apartment up there. There's actually an apartment that Al built for he and his wife, Mary Jane, and there's a bedroom and a bathroom and closets and everything, and that way they didn't have to drive. At the time they were in Sunnyside, they built something closer, but it was just so that they had a place to stay if they were too tired to drive all the way across town. Anyway, because the reason I say that is I ended up using that to change clothes and stuff, and I'll explain. So I had heard about this through Paul Fansler, and these are people that I admired, both those gentlemen. And he said, you know, Al's looking for somebody. I said, oh, set me up an interview, please, set me up an interview. So one weekday morning, you know, before the restaurant opened, I had an appointment with Al Pardini, probably about 10 o'clock in the morning. And the front door was unlocked, the bar was dark, but the bartender that was prepping or something said, go have a seat and we'll get a hold of Al. So Al was a man of few words, but when he spoke, you listened. And he knew. I always say that he forgot more than most people knew about the restaurant business. He was just amazing. You know, I could set up a banquet room and think that it looked beautiful, but we needed 20 more people in it. And he could come in and put 30 more seats and make it look better. It's just that way. He was one of the first people that I think in Fresno that actually had a dedicated banquet kitchen. He set up a banquet kitchen when he built that restaurant just for banquets. And of course, as we all know as Fresnans, Jimmy Pardini is the only caterer that can serve 1,000 people and every steak is medium rare and everything is hot. And I think that was his dad's teachings, you know, it really was. That's a great family. Anyway, but the funny part of the story is that I've always tried to kind of be confident in what I want and what I'm going to do. So those of you that remember Al, he was a balding, large man, and I was probably at least 30 to 50 pounds heavier at the time. I had played football in high school and college and had stopped playing football after my son was born and just kept eating and not working out, so I had gained a lot of weight. So I was a large Italian man. And Al walked in, and Al wore these half glasses, and he would do this and look over the top of his glasses all the time. So he had some papers he was looking at, looking down like that, and he says, "So," he says, "I understand you're looking for a job." I said, "Yeah, I am, sir." And I'm 24 years old. And he's probably in his late 50s, early 60s at least. He says, "So what do you want to do?" Didn't miss a beat. I said, "I want to run this joint." I'm saying this at a 24-year-old kid that attended bar and cooked around town to the top restaurateur in town at the time and the top restaurant. And I remember distinctly, Al just didn't say a word, looked over the top of his glasses and said, "Well, I guess you better start tomorrow then." The man never told me, and this was I know it was my parents' upbringing. I never asked. He never told me when to come to work. He never told me when to leave. He never told me how much he was going to pay me. Always treated me fairly, more than fairly. But I came and did everything. I did everything. I tended bar. When a cook didn't show up, I cooked. When a dishwasher didn't show up, I washed dishes. I set up banquets. Well, it got to a point where he said, "Hey, you know, you might want to leave a fresh shirt and a fresh suit upstairs so that you can change before the dinner crowd comes in." Because I was just working day and night and having a ball, just having a ball. As it turned out, as much as I loved the restaurant business, and boy, those people in the industry know that's a life dedication. If you want to be as good as Al was and as good as the Pardini family is, it's what you do. It's just what you do. And so it got to a point to where I decided I wanted to be a deputy sheriff. I had lost weight, I was working hard, I was eating right, and so I wanted to become a deputy sheriff. Well, a little funny note about that, I was pretty naive and didn't understand anything about it other than the fact that my dad was a sergeant on the sheriff's department. I wanted to be a deputy sheriff, I'm healthy, I could probably start tomorrow, right? Well, I left Al Pardini on very good terms, and Al was so good to me, he offered me other jobs, offered me to get jobs in the Bay Area, offered me at the time, Big Garden Country Club was looking for a food and beverage manager. He said, "I can get you that job too if you want." I said, "No, it's not you, it's the industry. I just can't, you know, I want to be a deputy sheriff." So anyway, I left, and of course, I took the tests and so on. They said, "Well, we'll call you." And I was out of a job because I was too proud to go back. And so I ended up doing all kinds of odd jobs during the time I was waiting to go to work at the sheriff's department. But anyway, so I went to work for the sheriff's department, and I had a really great career, and I'm really proud of that career. I did everything I ever wanted to do. You know, I worked in every area of Fresno County. I worked undercover for quite some time. Really enjoyed that. I worked vice intelligence as an undercover officer and learned a lot about Fresno and Fresno history and the things that have gone on here over the centuries and stuff. And so many of it came back to the old Italian communities, and you know, we're not naive enough to think that there wasn't a lot of stuff going on in Fresno in the old days. There was a lot of stuff going on in the old days. So it was kind of even a history lesson for me. I really enjoyed that. But as I said, about 7 years old, 8 years old, my son came to live with me. And so I was really busy raising my son, I was farming at the time. I had moved back out to the farm, and my dad was getting up in years and really didn't want to farm anymore. And he pretty much said, you know, if you want to farm, it's time to come back out to the farm. If you don't, I'm going to sell it. Well, that wasn't an option for me. I wanted to keep up. I mean, I was farming land. My dad was farming land, and I eventually farmed land that my grandfather, Dominic, had planted in the 20s. And so that was really, you know, because my father inherited my grandfather's land, and then my dad had expanded. And so my thought was, I need to come back out there and find a place. And my parents, of course, helped me buy 35 acres of vineyard out there near their ranches. So I ended up farming full-time too. So I was farming full-time. I was a full-time deputy sheriff at the time. After I left undercover, I was working as a training officer, training young deputies, which, you know, anybody that's ever been in any profession, I think it kind of rejuvenates your career a little bit when you train people and you remember why you did it and how exciting it was to you, you know, at the time. But what happened is that I heard about something amazing in Fresno. And I thought it was just amazing because they started a law school. What happened is that three visionaries, really, one of them is still alive, but Dan Iman was a municipal court judge. Loomis, I think it's Harold Loomis, I'm not sure of the first name, but Mr. Loomis, and Oliver Wanger. Oliver Wanger is a retired federal judge, was one of the most famous attorneys in the Valley, I think. And he was an attorney at the time, was later a federal judge, and now he's back practicing law again for his retirement. But they said, you know, it's not right that we have really good people here in Fresno that would make excellent lawyers that have to go out of town to go to law school. I mean, many of them have good jobs, have families, have careers, and they really would make excellent attorneys, but they can't leave their job, they can't leave their family, they can't spend tens of thousands of dollars going to one of the law schools out of town. Kind of on the McGeorge pattern. McGeorge started as a night law school also. So those three men actually gave birth to San Joaquin College of Law. And that's something I'm extremely proud of. I'm on the board now for San Joaquin College of Law and on the alumni board. And I'm very, very proud of that law school, I really am. So these three men actually taught classes, got other lawyers to teach classes. It was only a night school. They rented space from Fresno Pacific College for their first years, and then they moved to a building on Shields Avenue when I started in 1984. And now they have a real beautiful building. They took over the old Clovis High School building, and we've celebrated many anniversaries now since its inception. And gosh, we have some, I mean, from district attorneys, judges, political people, we just have so many good famous lawyers and stuff. It's an excellent law school. Well, enough for them, but I found out about it and I thought, wow, there's a law school here. And they didn't have any financial aid or anything, but luckily the tuition was low enough that I could actually save part of my salary and pay the tuition as I went. And it was 4 nights a week, 4 nights a week from I think 6:30 to 9:30. And it was, you know, I was working full time. I was able to transfer, because the Sheriff's Department was very cooperative, I had to take a little cut in pay, but I was able to transfer back into the courthouse as a bailiff. Now, oddly enough, that was great experience, because not only did I get to know the judges, not only did I get to know the lawyers, but I really got to see the law in action more than I did as a young boy in the Kerman Justice Court. So I transferred back into the courthouse so I could have nights off and weekends off. But here I was raising, at the time he was in high school, and raising a 14, 15, 16-year-old boy out on the farm and still farming full time and going to law school 4 nights a week. And pretty much at that point, you need to tell all your family and friends that I'll see you in 4 years, because when you're not reading and studying, you're in class. And the courthouse was a great environment because, frankly, it enabled me to not only get to know the lawyers and the judges, but it enabled me to have access to the law library right there. It enabled me to get a lot of reading done in the courtroom when court wasn't in session and such. And it was just a fascinating experience. I met so many great lawyers, and they became friends. Little side note, many people have heard the name of Miles, Sears and Ignani. It's a famous firm here in town, old firm. Bob Sears, when he was still alive, was in court preparing for a case, and he saw one of my law books, and he said, "Oh, you're going to law school?" Because in law school you have a very famous blue, all of the case, whether it's criminal law, real property, they're blue case books. That's what they are. And so he recognized the book right away. He said, "You're going to law school." He says, "You know what you're really gaining more than anything else? Working here as a bailiff." I said, "What's that?" He says, "Backroom access." He says, "You know, it takes a young lawyer 10 years to get to know the judges well enough to walk in the back and feel comfortable and say, 'Hi, Your Honor, how you doing?' And he says, you're really going to have a leg up on that, because the courtroom's where you studied, the courtroom's where you live." He says, "You're going to be very comfortable in the courtroom, and you're going to know the judges. And although you're not going to call them on a first name basis, you know, you're certainly going to have a comfort level that other people don't have." I have to share a funny story, and I have the printout that someone mounted for me. It's from the legal newspaper in California. We have a daily journal, they call it, but there's an LA edition and a San Francisco edition, but it's the legal newspaper for California, if you will. And they do interviews on new judges. And so it's really, it's something I have mounted in my house. It talks about someone, judge goes from the farm to the bench, you know, because I was still farming full time and so on. But an interesting little side note, I had gone to the Judges College up in Berkeley, and which all judges go to as part of your training. It's a 2-week program up at Berkeley. I had gone to the Judges College, so I had made friends from all over the state, and this newspaper goes out to all over the state. This LA reporter, I'm sure, had never heard the term backroom access. Now, all he knew was, or his editor, was that, well, he's from the farm, and this is Fresno, and of course anybody that has lived here as long as we have, you know, I used to go to judges meetings when we still had in-person classes stuff, and they'd see Jim Petrucelli, Fresno Court, and they'd go, "Oh, Fresno, that's that really neat little country town down in the valley, isn't it?" He says, "Yeah, it's the 5th largest city in the state now." Anyway, but in this article, the reporter actually wrote that I had said about Bob Sears, "What you're really gaining is buck ram access." And of course, when I read it, I'm going, buck ram access? And of course, as you can imagine, I was flooded with emails with lawyers, friends, and judges from all over the state going, "What the hell have you people got in Fresno? Buck ram access? Is that something we should know about?" I said, no. I said back room access. And apparently he either wrote it down or his editor thought it was some country term that nobody had ever heard of. But so anyway, so I was lucky enough to work for Gene Crum most of my law school career. And Gene was just, he was so encouraging and so great. He really was. He, I'll say it now, and nobody can do anything, but he even gave me his key to the law library, and the judges weren't supposed to do that. So I had access on weekends. I could go in there on weekends, and of course my study partners and stuff were elated because we had access to the best law library in the county on weekends, and we'd study in the courtroom on weekends and stuff. And so he was just great. He taught me a lot. He he's probably got a lot of funny stories too, but I have to share one funny story that he would enjoy. He pretty much gave me open access when I was studying. And that included being able to go out and get a book out of the library. And I would read, especially on civil cases. When he did civil cases, I didn't have a prisoner in custody. So when you had a prisoner in custody, you certainly had to be more on top of things. But when it was a civil case, you know, you learn to kind of know if he's excusing the jury, or if we're going to take a break, or whatever is happening. You kind of can listen to that and know. Something you kind of learn as a police officer too. You know, you can talk and still hear your call numbers. You could be talking to somebody, but you still hear your call numbers. So he gave me pretty much unencumbered access to his law library and his chambers library. And so one day, and this is a cute story that he shared with me, and of course, I think any bailiff in the court gets very close to his staff and his judge. And you know, it's a family, if you will. You protect the judge, you protect the staff, and they watch out for you and stuff. But our court reporter, Sharon, and our clerk, David, knew that I came and went, especially on a civil case. I came and went. Now, a little side note so you understand, in those days in the Fresno County Courthouse, this would have been in the 80s, we had, and it was very confusing to people, we had municipal court and we had Superior Court. Municipal Court, Superior Court. Superior Court was in the higher floors and so on. But there was 2 Department 1s, 2 Department 2s, 2 Department 3s, and so on, because it was Department 1 of the Superior Court, Department 1 of the Municipal Court. And the Municipal Court does all of the misdemeanors, but it also does preliminary hearings for felonies. So many times they involve weapons. So the courtroom's almost empty, and this civil law and motion calendar is going on. A couple of attorneys, no jury, very few spectators, and this is going on. So I'm in and out of the courtroom. Well, apparently, while I was out of the courtroom at some point, this very, very large man walked in the back with a shotgun at port arms. In those days, we didn't have metal detectors in the courthouse. He just walked in with a shotgun and sat down and put the shotgun in front of him. Now, the judge had his head down in his papers and didn't see this. The court reporter did. And she got the attention of the clerk. Psst, psst. And the judges, the lawyers are talking. David. He sees it. So he nudges the judge and he goes, "Judge, there's a man in the back of the courtroom with a gun." And of course, Judge Crum was just, he was as calm as a cucumber about everything. He said, "Where's Petro?" And David said, "I think he's in the law library." So here's this Superior Court judge in an open courtroom. And according to David, he goes, "Sir, you with the gun, can you tell me what I can do to help you?" And he says, everybody in the courtroom kind of hits the ground. And he stands up with this gun and says, "Yes, I'm Officer so-and-so. I'm here for the preliminary hearing." And the judge says, "Well, I think you're looking for Municipal Court Department 2. So it's downstairs." But, you know, it's just one of those funny stories. I happened to be gone at the wrong time. Now, any other judge could have got me in trouble, I'm sure. But he was good to me. He was really good to me, and I thank him for that. Anyway, so I went to law school for 4 years. And this is another real soft spot in my heart. I worked for Judge Crum, but on either side of me, there was Judge Keys. We were on the 6th floor. Judge Keys was on one side, and Judge Harris was on the other side. And alternately, during that time, Judge Crum never did family law, but both of these other judges did family law. And you know, I was starting as a lawyer at 40 years old. You got to keep in mind, at the time, San Joaquin College of Law was second career people. We honestly, it was a night school. We didn't have any students in my class that came from college. They had all graduated from college and worked in some industry for some period of time. I mean, we had everything from truck drivers, frankly, to businessmen, very successful insurance men, women that were in the medical industry, nurses, you name it. I mean, it was a fascinating group because they were all second careers. As one of my friends at graduation said, because they always read a little something about your background before you were hooded with your doctorate, said to me afterwards, "This is like a whole group of overachievers. You guys all had careers that anybody'd be happy with." I mean, I was a deputy sheriff for 15 years, another 5 years, and so I would have enough time for retirement. But anyway, so we were all second career people going to San Joaquin. There was no students right out of the chute. And of course, law school historically has had a big dropout rate and a big attrition rate because of the hard grading. You know, it's one of those, we tease sometimes that, you know, the doctorate is kind of the last bastion of higher education. It's like undergraduate degrees now are, you don't have to work too awfully hard. But if you're going to get your doctorate, they're going to put you through the ringer and they're going to flunk a lot of people out. They just do. So anyway, at 40 years old, I was starting off. So I'm getting close to my end of my 4-year legal education, and I'm watching on both sides. Judge Keyes does family law, Judge Harris does family law. And quite frankly, I recognize that, you know, this is an area that's very interesting to me. Most people will tell you when you go through law school, you find something that's very interesting to you, and I kind of locked on to community property. But community property community property interests are usually only in the very successful marriages, shall we say, where you have property, you have businesses, and that's where it gets really interesting, very interesting. And so I decided that, you know, I was starting off at 40. I had a lot of life experience as a police officer and as a restaurateur and such. I wanted to go into something that I could be successful in, quite frankly, but I also wanted something that was interesting. Well, there was, if you will, 3 top guns in Fresno at the time in the family law arena. There was Bill Rickard, there was Steve Calmacarian, and there was Judy Soley. Those were really the 3 top guns that I targeted. Well, it didn't take long for me to find out that Bill Rickard had a summer clerk by the name of Kathy Donovan, who was a very successful family law attorney to this day, and she was going to work for Bill Rickard. So that was out. And Steve Calmacarian had a son who had already gotten his accounting degree, but had gone back to law school and decided that he wanted to go be a family law attorney for Steve. And today, David Calmacarian is a Superior Court judge. In fact, he's our presiding Superior Court judge. So I very quickly latched on to Judy Soley. And so this is a woman that I tell the story, and I spoke at her funeral, and I meant every word I said. This is a woman that took a chance on a 40-year-old cop. I mean, who would hire a 40-year-old cop? As my very young legal assistant told me at the time after she got to know me, and I was smart enough to know I didn't know much, and she knew a lot. She says, "I was really kind of nervous about you coming to work here." She said, "You know, you were 40 years old, you've been a cop for a long time. I figured you thought you were going to know everything." I said, "No, I was smart enough to know I didn't know anything, Lisa, and you knew a lot about everything." So I went to Judy, and again, you know, my family background dictated that, you know, you really got to sell yourself to somebody. You got to work hard. So I said, "Judy," I said, "I'd really like to have a chance to like intern with you. No pay, no nothing." I was still at the Sheriff's Department. I was in the courthouse. I was finishing up my last year of school. I said, "Just throw me a bone once in a while. I'll work on weekends. I'll work after work. I'll work on holidays that we have and stuff, and I'll do motions. I'll do research, whatever you want me to do." Well, she was an amazing woman, and she saw that I had some talent right away, so she offered me a job immediately, and told me as soon as you pass the bar, you're going to be my associate. So I was Judy Soley's first associate. And it's funny because Leslie Soley, her daughter, who's now practicing family law in town, was a little girl at the time, and I got to see Leslie grow up. But anyway, so Judy and I were together for many years, and you know, I was able to It was just a beautiful experience because I was able to handle cases. Judy was one of the top attorneys in town. And as such, she was expensive and she took a large retainer. But there was a whole lot of people that would get referred to Judy or that wanted to go to Judy, but they couldn't afford her. Well, here's this brand new attorney who, you know, he's working under Judy's auspices. She's watching what he's doing. I'm going to go with him. So I was able to handle cases that, frankly, it takes 20 years for a lawyer to see. And it was just an amazing opportunity. But she took a chance on me. She took on a chance on a 40-year-old cop who was brand new, that wasn't worth much at the time, you know. She was an incredible woman. She let me go and paid for everything. She let me go to all the training in the world because I had to run as fast as I could to keep up with these cases that most lawyers see after 10 years of practice. She was an incredible woman, and I will be eternally grateful for her giving my career that start. And most of you know the story. She was killed by a client's husband, and it just was tragic. And I'll be forever indebted to Judy Soley. I will. Anyway, so I went to work for Judy Soley and was practicing for a number of years with her. Then I had an opportunity, Cassandra Dunn, who was another well-known family law attorney here in town, she was wanting to retire, and she offered to give me her practice and sell me her part of a building she owned downtown with some other lawyers here in town, Angelo Ferrari and some others. And so I moved into my own practice. My practice continued. I moved out to Shaw Avenue after a period of time. My practice grew. I hired a number of paralegals and associates working for me, and everything was really running on autopilot. It was great. But in the back of my mind, I always had this idea that I wanted to be a judge. And you know, in those days, this was still in the 90s, in those days, you really had to have 10 years in California. You still have to have 10 years as a practicing attorney to become a Superior Court judge. But in those days, really, the governors appointed lawyers that had been practicing for 20 years and so on, and you know, had been around for a long time. Today, we're appointing people a lot younger, and quite frankly, that has to do with some of the retirement issues and stuff. You really do need to stay on the bench for a long time, and if you hire older fellas, they don't stay as long, or women, they don't stay as long. Anyway, so in those days, it was something that I knew was in the back of my mind, but it was out in the future somewhere. Well, lo and behold, I had been, as I mentioned previously, my father had been an elected official in the Kerman Judicial District for years. He had been elected constable for years, very well known. I when I started farming out there, I was on a elementary school board, Sun Empire Elementary School. Then I was on Kerman High School board. And then I was actually, I'm proud of this too, I was a founding member of the Kerman Unified School District. And you know, we built a whole school district. And so I had been an elected official. And then as a lawyer, I was elected to the North Central Fire Protection District Board and was president of that board for 6 years. And they're responsible for fire and ambulance service in the Kerman, Biola area, central area, and actually some of the Fig Garden area. Anyway, so I was an elected official in that area. Well, at the time, I had this idea that I wanted to be a judge, but it was kind of on a back burner. And I had as I recall, three very well-respected lawyers who wanted to be judges, obviously, come to me and say, look, you know, we know your background. We know your family's background. We're planning on running for judge in the Kerman Judicial District. Now, let me stop there at that point. What happened, and it's an interesting progression because we talked about non-lawyer judges, justice court judges. Well, the state of California is really a leader in the law. I mean, they say that New York and California are the leaders in the law. Our court decisions, our laws, passing the bar in those two states is the hardest and so on. So what happened was the state said very early on, you know, we really need lawyers as judges. I mean, this doesn't make any sense that we just have a nice guy in the community be the judge. Okay, so then they passed a requirement that you had to be a lawyer for 5 years to be a municipal court judge. So they really made all of the judicial court judges in California municipal court judges. So the Kerman Judicial District, along with all of the other judicial districts, became the Central Valley Municipal Court. And the Central Valley Municipal Court incorporated all these former justice courts as municipal courts. Well, another thing that was bad about the justice court system, even when they made them lawyers, they were still justice court judges. Well, it was a part-time gig. You were in you were in Kerman, and maybe you worked 2 or 3 days a week. So they let them practice law still. Well, you can imagine the conflicts. You can imagine the conflicts. You just can't practice law and try and make a living and still, because the pay wasn't very much. So when they made this municipal court, the Central Valley Municipal Court, they elevated them to municipal court judges and actually gave them municipal court judges' salary. And then at that point they said, well, because we're doing this, you're going to have to go to Fresno on those other 2 or 3 days a week, and we'll find some work for you because they always needed judges. You're going to have to go to this county, Tulare County. You're going to have to go to Madera County. And so the judges were very fungible among the municipal courts. So at that time, it was a municipal court judge. And I had 9 years as an attorney at the time. So these lawyers came to me and said, you know, we know your background, we know your family. If you're not going to run, we're going to run, and we'd like you to endorse us. So, you know, my practice is on autopilot. I'm just loving what I'm doing. I'm making good money and everything. In those days, municipal court judges didn't make very much. Superior court judges didn't make very much. I was making more money. It was a cut and pay, but it was something that was always a pipe dream for me. And one of the things that I neglected to add, that little oak desk that I talked about earlier, when they closed down the Justice Court and made it a municipal court, they changed everything around. I mean, they had a very different bench with plywood and everything. But this little oak desk, my mother was able to buy it from the county, and she gave it to me. And I had it in my home most of my adult life, and now my son has it in his home. So that little desk that I sat at as a little boy, she had it refinished and everything, so it's kind of a neat memory. But so they came to me and said, you know, this is what we're going to do. So I kind of, you know, sometimes people will tell you that it's really sometimes, you know, opportunity comes, and if you don't take it, your life is completely different. So even though I was enjoying my practice, even though everything was wonderful, I decided that I needed to run. So I actually was an elected judge, and which is kind of unusual. Judges are either appointed or elected, and we see every once in a while when a judge retires at the right time, or they create a new position sometimes. There is actually a judicial election. And in this case, there was a judicial election. And so I ran for the Kerman Municipal Court. And I had 9 years on, so I had plenty of time. And so I'm running a campaign because I had a defense lawyer from Fresno who actually was the district attorney, Bill Smith's nephew, and a very competent, very well-respected lawyer who was running against me. Now, there was only one candidate because it was kind of a unfair race in that the biggest population base was in Kerman. There was some rural areas, but you know, I was well known. I'd been elected for many years, so it was a landslide victory. But the interesting thing about that is that I had 9 years on. And in that same election, and of course anybody that's ever been in any kind of an election, you don't really worry about anything else on the election. You're worried about your race. And so I'm running as hard as I can. I'm having fundraisers. I'm doing my thing. In that very same election, the state of California decided to consolidate all of the municipal courts into superior courts. Now, on that issue, it was a very good decision from the state's standpoint because courts would become fungible. You know, the way it worked was you had municipal courts and you had superior courts. These couldn't do some of these things, and these judges couldn't do some of these things. Well, now judges in California are fungible. When I was on the bench, if they needed me in traffic, I could go work traffic. If I wasn't in a trial, I could go do anything. It didn't work that way before. So it was very efficient from a fiscal standpoint and very good for the public. Now the downside of that, which I have been a vocal advocate is, of is that the law has become so sophisticated that for one judge to know everything is almost impossible. I could be working a felony trial today, and then I could be working, domestic violence tomorrow. And that's very difficult because things change rapidly in the law. But nonetheless, that's the way it works. So in this very same election, the people of the state of California decide that all of the municipal courts should become superior courts. So I get elected, and I'm as happy as you can imagine. And Gene Gomes, a good friend of mine, calls me and he says, "What are we going to do?" I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, you have to have 10 years to be a Superior Court judge, and you only have 9 years." I said, "Oh my God." And of course, all my supporters and my family are going, "Well, you just got elected. What? They're going to make you a Superior Court judge." I go, "No, you don't understand. The law is the law." Well, luckily, Jim Costa has been a lifelong family friend of mine. We went to the same church and everything, and his father and my father were dear friends. So I got a hold of Jimmy and I said, "Can you find out what's going on? Because I'm really nervous, and the presiding judge of the Fresno court is afraid to swear me in or do anything else, So luckily, a little interesting side note here too. Luckily, somebody in the assembly sent it to the legislative analyst's office, and they foresaw this problem. They said, what if we got somebody that's either elected, like I was, or previously selected? In other words, there was 4 people in the same June election. They were selected to be in a runoff in November. What if they were previously selected or previously elected? Are we going to grandfather them in? And luckily, that's what they decided to do. So I was grandfathered in. So I was the first Superior Court judge with only 9 years of experience. So, here I was, an elected judge, and which, there's a little bit of hierarchy among the judges and stuff. The governor usually picks judges, and quite frankly, there's a little bit of a pecking order, and I'm not saying that to denigrate anyone, but you have to prove yourself. You have to prove yourself. And so I decided I was going to work as hard as I could. And Jim Kwasnick was my presiding judge. And I told him, and I told our calendar clerk, whatever you need, whenever you need it, and if I don't know about it, I'll figure it out. And so I was able to really do well very quickly because of my work ethic, again, taught by my parents. Just stick your head in there and do what you're asked to do and keep your mouth shut. So I put my head down and worked real hard, and I'm very proud of the fact that I was presiding judge of the Family Law Division because that was my background for 6 years. And then I took over a felony trial court, and the last 12 years of I did some time in Coalinga, as I've mentioned, but the last 12 years of my career I did felony trials, and so I'm very proud of my judicial career. I had my ups and downs. I was kind of old school. I'm not going to hide anything. I was old school. I learned, back in the 70s, early 70s, when I was a bailiff. When you first start off, you start off as a bailiff. I kind of patterned myself after a lot of those old judges. And then even in the 80s, when I was going to law school, I kind of patterned myself after some of those old judges. So I had to learn some lessons. The world had changed, and I had to learn that you have to change with the world. But I'm very proud of my judicial career, and as near as I can tell, I'm the only judge in Fresno County of 100% pure Italian heritage. So that's an incredible source of pride for me. And I hearken back to my grandmother looking at that great hall and saying, I wonder what my children and my grandchildren can accomplish in this world, in this new world that I'm sacrificing for. So I sat there and I thought, wow, Grandma, you'd be so proud of me. So that's where I am today. I retired after 20 years on the bench, and as much as I loved it, I don't go back and work because I think it's important to let the young blood take over, and I also think it's important to remove yourself from some of the bad things. It was a hard transition for me. There's things that people don't realize about being a judge that are difficult. We talk about vicarious trauma. A judge is expected to be very stoic in the courtroom. And yet you have children that have been hurt, suffering in court. You have witnesses that have lost loved ones suffering in court, and you're expected to be emotionless. So that's difficult. That's difficult. But so I think it's just best. I'm enjoying life. I'm remarried and very happy, and we're traveling. And I thank my family for everything they've done for me, the sacrifices they made. So many generations sacrificed so hard for all of our families, immigrants, all of the different immigrant groups. And I think the Italians have been a major part of this county. They really have. They celebrated hard, they loved hard, and they worked hard. And that's what they knew. They sacrificed a lot for a better life for their children and their grandchildren. So that's my story.